been argued by the former administration and by the big polluters for many, many years, and by their indentured servants in our political process, that, we have to choose between economic prosperity on the one hand and environmental protection on the other, and that is a false choice. In 100% of the situations, good environmental policy is always identical to good economic policy if we want to measure the economy, and this is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generations, over the long term, and how it preserves the value of the assets of our community. And from Dick Cheney's side of the fence, which is to treat the planet as if it were a business in liquidation, convert our natural resource to cash as quickly as possible, have a few years of pollution-based prosperity, we can generate an instantaneous cash flow and the illusion of a prosperous economy, but our children are going to pay for our joyride. In England, virtually everybody accepts the scientific reality behind global warming. But they haven't been bombarded, as we have in our country, with a $150 million propaganda campaign by the carbon cronies, by Chevron and Exxon and Ford Motor Company, who's one of the big payers in this, Massey Coal, which have funneled all this money into a giant propaganda campaign over the past 15 years. They've hired these slick public relations firms like Burst and Marcella, and then they created all of these phony think tanks on Washington, D.C., who are paid for with polluter money, like the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute. And you've heard of them because they're the same people who are criticizing, public education in this country and saying we've got to get rid of it and say it's a luxury we can't afford. The press, which has completely become kind of a karaoke group for, Karl Rove over the past 8 years, will say this stuff, the Academy of Sciences did an inventory of all of the scientific papers that have been done, peer-reviewed papers, that have been done about global warming, published peer-reviewed papers about global warming between 1996 and 2006. There were over 10,000 papers, and all of them, without exception, agreed on the fundamentals. Global warming is real, we're experiencing it now, human beings are causing it, its impact's going to be catastrophic. There were various nuances and predictions about how soon it's going to happen, how quickly, and how, what the precise carbon ratios and concentrations in the environment need, but all of them were agreed on the fundamentals. At the same time, there's a huge disconnect between science and public reality, and that's because propaganda works. And, and it has infiltrated the American media, which used to become, that was the bulwark of our democracy. As corporations have taken, there's now 5 corporations that control all 14,000 radio stations in our country, all 2,200 TV stations, 80% of our newspapers, all of our billboards, and most of the large internet content providers. So there's 5 guys who are deciding what we hear in the news. And Ronald Reagan abolished the requirements that, the fairness doctrine, that they actually report the news, and now they're giving us entertainment. The law since 1928 that required that. That's why we have a 6 o'clock news hour in our country. Not because the networks wanted it, they were forced to have it because the airwaves belong to the public. And the networks are licensed to use them, but only if they use them to advance the public interest by informing us about the news that we need to understand and make rational decisions in a democracy. But they always wanted to put entertainment in that slot because the news was losing, the news departments were always economic money losers. But they had to do that as a condition of their license. Reagan abolished that. He abolished all the requirements for local control and diversity of control of the news. So now you've got this situation where these giant corporations control all the news organs of our society, and they no longer put an obligation to serve their public interest. The only obligation is their shareholders, and they serve that obligation by entertaining us rather than informing us. And so they appeal to the prurient interest that all of us have in the reptilian core of our brains for sex and celebrity gossip. And they, Americans know more about Tom Cruise and Kate than they do about global warming, or what happens. And what really happens happens when you privatize Social Security? You know, who gets rich? Wall Street. Who gets, you know, screwed, excuse me, the rest of us? Well, what happens when you let the pharmaceutical industry write, you know, the national health care programs and the HMOs, et cetera, et cetera? We don't understand those connections anymore, so it just kind of happens. And there's a tremendous complacence because we don't have a news media that's working in this country. And part of the issue, the reason people don't understand the urgency of global warming is because it's not being given priority. In England, they don't, you know, they haven't been subjected to this propaganda campaign, and everybody accepts, virtually everybody accepts the scientific reality behind global warming. But there are still vested interests in others who say, we have to move incrementally, we have to move slowly, because if we move too precipitously, that it will cause grave dislocations in the marketplace. And this is going to hurt us in the long term. And Lord Putnam was addressing the concerns of that cohort. And Lord David Putnam, for those of you who don't know him, is one of the great visionaries in England today, and he's one of the great leaders of Parliament. He's also a wonderful filmmaker who made Chariots of Fire and a lot of other great films. But he was addressing just the concerns of that cohort. And he reminded Parliament that exactly 200 years before, the same body had debated the abolition of the slave trade. And at that time, virtually everybody in England believed that slavery was an abomination, that it was a moral catastrophe that had to be abolished. But the question was, how do you do it? How quickly and how soon? And people said, we can't do it, you know, overnight, because slavery at that time represented 25% of the GNP of Great Britain. And it was the principal source of energy for the entire British Empire, free human labor. And they said, if you abolish it outright, the economy's going to crater. But after a year of debate, Parliament made the moral choice and abolished slavery literally overnight. And instead of collapsing, the British economy exploded as thousands of entrepreneurs rushed into that space to create new forms of energy, mainly mechanical ones, in an era that we now know as the Industrial Revolution, which was the greatest epic in wealth creation in the history of mankind. And the abolition of the slave trade had exposed all of these hidden inefficiencies that were associated with free human bondage. Well, today, we don't need to abolish carbon to understand that our deadly addiction to it is the principal drag on American capitalism. We are borrowing $1 billion a day, mainly from nations that don't share our values, in order to import $1 billion of oil a day, mainly from nations that don't share our values, and indeed many of them are outright hostile to us. I mean, we're funding both sides of the war against terror through our addiction to oil. And we give to the oil industry every year, the richest industry in the history of mankind, we give $1.3 trillion worth of subsidies. Now, if you have doubts about that figure, look at Terry Tammann's new book, Lives Per Gallon. Terry Tammann just stepped down as head of California EPA. He's an internationally respected figure, and he scrupulously and inventory this huge raft of subsidies that we give to the oil industry every year, including direct federal payments like the oil depletion allowance, which the Obama administration, President Obama 2 weeks ago, promised to abolish all of the direct subsidies, which is a wonderful thing. But we also get these huge indirect subsidies. And all of these other subsidies he does not include in his accounting estimate the cost of the Gulf War, which the current Gulf War, which OMB now says over 20 years is going to cost $4.3 trillion, and which should be billed to their account. He doesn't also include the cost of carbon, which those costs are going to be, the carbon emissions are going to be enormous on our society. And they should also be billed to their account. We give $500 billion to the nuke industry. We give almost $1 trillion to the coal industry. Nobody's ever gone out and evaluated it. That would be a very, very good project for some of your school children. But the United States government actually 2 weeks ago did a study by the National Research Council in which they said that the health impact of burning coal, the cost to our country, are $132 billion a year. Just the